Hello everyone, welcome back. Let's continue working on the user resource part. So last time we left at here, we're creating the user post method, and we have two conditional check to check the username or is the email exists or not, which utilize the user service, and we have the user service created, but we don't have the user repository created. So let's create our user repository, and this would be an interface. User repository. This will be extending the CRED repository and user along. We're going to define some method. Find by username, find by email. List user, find, or we're going to import some of the packages. And again, Spring Boot will be smart enough to understand what this method means. Okay, and we just need to come back and okay, it looks like we have the user repository added, so that's good. Let's come back to our user resource and continue working on it. So we have the conditional check, and then we can create a new user. So this user basically is empty, there's nothing in it. Okay, and we're gonna set the username. As the username we have test, we're gonna set email as user email, and then we're gonna create a password. Utilize the security utility dot random password method. We're gonna import the security utility as well. I'm going to create the encrypted password using security utility dot password encoder that encode the password we just created. Okay, and then we're going to set the password as encrypted password. We're not gonna set the raw password, but use the encryption by password. Okay. After that, we're gonna create a row. This would be a new row, and we're gonna set row ID as 1, because we know row ID 1 would be the normal user as from the database. Take a look at our row. We have the ID 0 as row admin, ID 1 as row user. So we're gonna set row ID as 1. And we have row.set name as row user. Set of user rows equals new hash set, and then we're gonna have user rows dot add new user row user and row. Okay. And we have the user service dot create user with user rows. Okay, so after we have the user created, we need to create a token, and this token will be well, let's forget about the token. Here we just need to use the simple mail message email equals to mail constructor that construct email, or say new user email with the user and password. Okay, and then we will have the mail sender that send email. This will return new response entity of user added successfully. HTTP status.ok. So we haven't created this mail constructor and mail sender yet, and we need to do that. So let's create a new folder underneath the bookstore folder. We're gonna call it utility, and we're gonna create a new class called mail constructor. Okay, and here we're gonna define some method, but first let's register the spin, and we're gonna define a construct new user email, which takes a user and the password, add these parameters, and what we're gonna do here is we're gonna create a new string message equals to enter. Please use the following credentials to log in and edit your personal information, including your own password. Okay, and then we're gonna have /n user name space plus user dot get username plus /n password plus password. Okay, let's get rid of the space here. So let's import this user and simple mail message. User get username. So this simple mail message is a class from the Spring Framework mail package. Okay, it's just a simple mail creator, and then we can use the simple mail message email equals to new simple mail message. Then email set to, we're gonna get the email from the user, and email this set subject would be list bookstore dash new user, and email that set text is a simple message, and email dot set from, and this would be mv dot get property support dot email, and return email. So we haven't defined this mv yet. we're gonna do it like here. Basically, it's just an environment variable from Spring Framework. Let's add a semicolon here. So this is our mail constructor. And let's come back to our user resource. We haven't wired up the beans for our mail constructor and mail sender. So here we're gonna auto wire mail constructor and Java mail sender. Okay. And here we have the construct new user email. Now here we have an error with this mail sender, and if you check the error message, is on the left corner. It says the type JavaX mail internet meme tags meme message cannot be resolved, and that's because we are lack of one dependency in our pom.xml. So if we go to our pom.xml file, we're gonna add one more dependency, and this is for JavaX mail package. So we can use the version 1.4.7. And let's come back, and the error should be gone. And the next thing we need to do is come back to our applications.property. So as you know, we can do the configuration setup here for our Spring Boot, and here we're gonna define the setup for our mail SMTP, and let me copy and paste in the code here. So basically here I'm using Gmail, to as the source to send emails, to send automatic emails from our bookstore system. And right now I have my username and password here. This password will be changed after the course is published, so you don't need to bother even to try. Or if you're curious, you can try, see if you can hack my email. But rather than that, this is pretty standard, things to set up for Spring email using the Gmail part. Okay, so I'm taking this as example. Other things should be similar using, other emails. Now let's restart the application. Oh, there's an error here. Let's see what error do we have. The declared package does not match the expect message. So that's user repository, this package and service. Alright, that's interesting. Is it on the service? User repository. Oh, okay, so that's not correct. We should move to our user repository here. Okay, it looks like there's something wrong here. We have two user repository, but obviously we don't need a user repository in our service folder. So let's just remove that. Okay, so we don't have any more error. That's good. Now we're starting the Spring Boot. Alright, Spring Boot is started. Now, before we start to test, we need to come back to our database and take a look at our user. So right now we have two users, right? And the first one is normal user, the second one is admin, and the normal user is something like this. So I would like to change to an out of my email. You can do it for your email as well, so that when the automatic system email is sent, you should be able to receive it from your own email address. Okay. So I'm gonna come back to our bookstore and log out and try to sign up. Oh, sorry, actually it doesn't really matter because we're gonna input our new email anyways. So let's put it back. Sorry about that. And we're gonna have our new username. I'll just say Ray or L, and email address. And create a new account. Click on that. So after a little while, it says email has been sent to the email address you just registered. Please validate the email address and update your password information. So let's come back to our email. So as you can see, we do receive the email, and it says title as list bookstore user, and it's from, and the email content says please use the following credentials to log in and edit your personal information, including your own password. We have the username and the randomly generated password. Let's copy that and see if we can actually log in. Okay, there we go. We have logged in, and we should have a new user added, which is listed here. Okay, so that's cool. All right, that looks good. We can add a new user now. And that's pretty much for this lesson. We'll continue in the next one. See you guys in the next video. Bye.